I studied at Central St Martin's, and that's really quite a traditional course in many ways.
Yeah,
You're taught how to design jewellery, but also how to make jewellery. But I wanted to do things for the stage or for fashion, and so I had to beg them for 2 showcases rather than 1, and I absolutely filled them with these collections of jewellery that really was probably more suitable for the catwalk. And the buyer from Liberty came along to see what Central Martin students were doing that year, and she was like, wow, this is amazing, would you design a collection from this for Liberty? And so I did.
And what did you think? Was that an unusual thing to happen at that age?
I felt somewhat out of sorts because I always thought I was a square peg in a round hole at Central, because there were all these people doing exactly what they were told, and I was a bit of a rebel. So I was really surprised, because I always felt like I was a black sheep. So to have that kind of validation suddenly like that, it was kind of like being showered with this wonderful kind of condonement of what I'd been up to. And the principal of the college came up to, my mum and dad were there, and I was talking, and he was saying, I suppose I have to say that your daughter may well do very well in life. Well, I'll never forget that.
And it turned out to be a prophecy. But the early stuff you were designing was very different to what you came to be known for, wasn't it? So tell us about that transition from fashion and catwalk pieces that would be better on the catwalk to the collections you've now become really well known for.
Well, I think it's because I am a designer, and I needed to go through experimental phases. I wanted to experiment with materials. I wanted to push the boundaries a bit. I certainly didn't want to be a staid old boring jewellery designer, which perhaps I am now, I don't know. But back then I wanted to do big things. I wanted to make a statement, but also, yes, I loved fashion. So I gravitated towards the fashion designers of the time, and I designed the jewellery for Rifat Ozbek, who was very, very famous in the 1980s. Bruce Oldfield, who was also very famous. He used to design clothes for Joan Collins and very glamorous people at the time, and I did their shows. And I suppose I was evolving, and you don't necessarily, it's like being a chef. You don't necessarily just make your iconic recipes first of all, you do all your experimentation.
I love what you just said then about the experimental phases, and as a designer, and that's probably true for all creatives, isn't it?
I think it is, yes.
But I've never heard it articulated in that way before. How many of these phases do you feel you've been through over the period of, say, 40 years?
I think it's countless, and interestingly enough, I'm going through another one now.
Right.
But I do think that if you are a creative person and you see things differently. I think you're not neurotypical. I'm not neurotypical. Everything is about interpreting what I see. And sometimes I think that, like a musician, you want to create to make the world a better place in some sense. You know what I mean? For yourself, but then for others. And whether I do or whether I don't, but I think you can create a little bit of happiness from what you make, and people want to buy it.
I do agree with that, absolutely, 100%. So there were a few things that put your business really on the map. I mean, obviously you were always on the map, Dinny. You were designing for big fashion shows.
I haven't always felt on the map, I must say. Sometimes I've rolled right off it, but there we are.
Well, we probably all feel like that. But you were designing for big fashion shows straight out of college and big designers. So you were pretty much on the map. But I suppose from the point of view of consumers and the public at large, there were a few things, a couple of movies and the location Notting Hill. Can we just talk about those? The impact of 4 weddings and a funeral, Bridget Jones, and then just having your flagship shop in Notting Hill and being a part of that community for 50 years.
Well, first, before I've had opened the store in Notting Hill in 1992, I had a studio in Beak Street, Soho, and that was another area of London where there were many creative film studios, and we were right next to a film production company. And I used to wave to them across these sort of turrets where my studio was, and there was a fashion costume director for weddings, a funeral was in there.
Oh, right.
So sometimes you're right place, right time. And she'd come up and she'd say, what are you doing? And we'd have these kind of party sales up there. And so it was kind of fostering the connections at the time. And she said, "Oh, I want to use all your jewellery for 4 Weddings on a Funeral, a movie I'm doing with Kristen Scott Thomas and Hugh Grant." And I was like, "Oh yeah, right." So that was even before I opened the store. But then by the time because it was years before, you know, and then they filmed, and so I think they were filming in 91. I can't really remember.
Yeah.
And then I made the move to Notting Hill, and then 4 Weddings and a Funeral came out. So that was probably one of the first incidences where there was a lot of attention on it, and we already had the shop by the time the film came out.
And what happened with Bridget Jones?
Well, once we were in Notting Hill, Helen Fielding was a young journalist in the area, and she was kind of writing this diary about single woman diary, and it's like living that life, and which was never quite glamorous enough, she felt, which we all know that one, don't we?
That's how we all feel.
We all think, oh, we want to be really glamorous. Oh, but I don't feel glamorous enough, you know. And so she wrote her first book, and then Bridget comes into the shop and buys a jewellery, and she makes a mention of the brand in the book, which was really lovely. And that kind of and then the Notting Hill movie, all those, the Bridget Jones, Notting Hill, and 4 Weddings and a Funeral was very much sort of satelliting around my brand in that store, and it really helped to bring people in and say, oh, this is a Notting Hill brand, and it's creative, and we're in the right place.
And what is it about Notting Hill that gave a brand like yours opportunity as well? Because it's not just the movies, it's the actual culture of Notting Hill as well, isn't it? And what the place is that brought opportunity to you.
Well, I think it goes right back to the 60s, because there was a film director called Nicholas Roeg, and he directed Performance, which was a movie with Mick Jagger in it and Anita Pallenberg. And it's one of those cult movies that if you see it, it's just absolutely incredible, so ahead of its time, about a criminal hanging out in Notting Hill who ends up with a rock star, and the rock star's Mick Jagger. And that's all filmed in All Saints Road. And so it had already had this sort of cutting edge rock music, but also the reggae and the West Indian scene which was vibrant and colourful, and the carnival, and it was an area where cultures mixed really well. And then all the celebrities started coming in, making it very much a place where paparazzis hung out. And it just seemed fun, and it was.
Over 40 years, you know, most brands can't survive 40 years. They come and they go, and I don't know what the average lifespan of a brand is, but
10 years, I think.
You think it's 10 years?
I think it's you have,
because most brands, you see them go on a trajectory, right? They come in and they do well, they then go up, and then they start sort of falling off, and they just become less relevant and gradually start fading. How have you kept a brand as alive as yours is for 4 decades? That's 4 times the average life cycle. What have you done? What's the secret?
I think one word is resilience.
Right.
And it's, you know, I tend to think of every knockback being an opportunity to see a way forward. And that doesn't mean to say that I haven't been in very dark places when fear of completely failing and almost completely failing. You know, there's been times when I've ended up in the High Court trying to save my brand, you know.
Was that one of the toughest experiences you've had in terms of going to the High Court?
Yes, it was because I had sold half the business to somebody, and then that partnership had turned sour.
I see. Okay.
And you know, you learn these things that are all about business, and as a creative person, you kind of tend to want to be a little bit blinkered with like, oh no, like that. But then you find yourself in situations where you're fighting for your brand name, perhaps, and that's what that was all about. And I did win in the end, but that took 7 years of battling through the courts.
And how did you recover emotionally from that period? Because, I mean, all entrepreneurs know there's ups, there's downs, there's highs and the lows. You've talked about resilience. What are some of the things you advise people on resilience? How did you find the resilience within yourself?
I'm not a Buddhist, but I do like to look at things in a kind of Buddhist way. In learning how to, if you can sort of clear your mind of we call it monkey chatter, which is this stuff that goes on and on and on, around and round and round. And
the stuff that's saying you're not good enough, that's going to fail, you know, who do you think you are, that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's about resilience, focus, and trying to eradicate fear, because it's always fear that really trips you up. And there's always going to be threats from all sorts of different angles, and boy, oh boy, are there threats now, you know, from outside sources that you have no control of at all. So but it's how you process these things and keep them at bay, and then work out how you can dodge. You know, I'm not a soothsayer, but you know, it's about trying to keep in that straight line, but working out when you have to veer off it a bit, to stop, reconsider, and try and remain confident.